Why did my mom choose her boyfriend over taking me to the ER after I collapsed? The moment my legs gave out underneath me, I watched my mother look directly at my face and then turn away to check her phone. I was lying on the bathroom floor of our apartment with my vision tunneling and my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and she glanced at me like I was a minor inconvenience interrupting her evening. I tried to call out for help, but my voice came out as a weak croak, and the cold tile against my cheek was the only thing keeping me from completely losing consciousness. My chest felt like someone had wrapped iron bands around it and was slowly tightening them with every breath I attempted to take. I could see her feet in the doorway, those ridiculous heels she'd bought specifically because her boyfriend Garrett said they made her legs look amazing, and she wasn't moving toward me. She was texting someone. The fluorescent bathroom light above me flickered twice, and I remember thinking that this couldn't actually be happening, that my own mother wouldn't just stand there while I was clearly dying on the floor. But she did. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, before finally sighing and saying that I needed to stop being so dramatic because they had reservations. I'd been living with my mother and her boyfriend Garrett for about 8 months when everything fell apart that night. My parents had divorced when I was 11, and I'd spent the years since splitting time between their houses in a custody arrangement that looked good on paper but felt like emotional ping-pong in practice. Dad lived about 40 minutes away in a small house near his construction company office, and I stayed with him every other weekend and Wednesday evenings. Mom got primary custody because she worked from home as a medical billing specialist and could theoretically provide more consistent supervision. That arrangement worked fine until she met Garrett Thornton at some networking event about a year and a half ago. Garrett was the kind of guy who wore expensive watches and talked about his investment portfolio within 5 minutes of meeting anyone new. He drove a luxury sedan that he washed every single weekend and made comments about how my sneakers were scuffing his hardwood floors. From the moment he moved in with us, I felt like a guest in my own home, like I was being tolerated rather than loved. Mom changed around him, becoming someone I barely recognized, always agreeing with his opinions and laughing at his jokes, even when they weren't funny. The night everything happened started normally enough, which is usually how the worst nights begin. I'd come home from swim practice around 5 in the afternoon, exhausted and hungry, and looking forward to a quiet evening doing homework. I'd been swimming competitively since I was 9 years old, and at 15, I was one of the top performers on my high school team, with legitimate hopes of swimming in college. Practice had been particularly grueling that day, with Coach Reyes pushing us through extra sets of butterfly drills that left my shoulders burning and my lungs aching. I remember feeling slightly off when I got home, a weird tightness in my chest that I attributed to overexertion, and a headache that had been building since lunchtime. Mom and Garrett were in the kitchen when I walked in, and she barely looked up from whatever Garrett was showing her on his laptop. She mentioned that they had dinner reservations at some new steakhouse downtown at 7, and that I should order myself a pizza because the leftovers in the fridge had gone bad. The dismissal stung, but I was used to being excluded from their date nights by then. I went to my room and tried to start my calculus homework, but the headache was getting worse, and the tightness in my chest hadn't subsided even after I'd cooled down from practice. I chalked it up to dehydration and drank 2 glasses of water, then lay down on my bed for what I thought would be a quick rest before tackling my assignments. The next thing I knew, I was waking up to complete darkness in my room, drenched in sweat with my heart racing like I'd just sprinted 100 meters. My phone said it was 6:45, which meant I'd been asleep for over an hour, and when I tried to sit up, the room spun so violently that I had to grab my bed frame to keep from falling off the mattress. Something was seriously wrong. My chest pain had evolved from tightness into actual sharp stabbing sensations with every breath, and when I touched my forehead, my skin was burning hot. I stumbled out of my room toward the hallway, intending to tell my mom I needed help, but I only made it about 10 feet before my legs buckled, and I collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the floor like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Mom found me in the hallway and asked what I was doing on the floor, her voice carrying that particular edge of irritation she'd developed since Garrett moved in. I tried to explain that something was wrong with my chest and that I couldn't breathe properly, but the words came out jumbled and weak. She crouched down and looked at me, and for a second I thought I saw genuine concern in her eyes, the mother I remembered from before the divorce, who would have immediately sprung into action. But then Garrett appeared behind her, already dressed in his dinner jacket, and asked if there was a problem because they needed to leave in 10 minutes. Mom's expression shifted, hardened into something I didn't recognize, and she told me I probably just had a bug and should go lie down and rest. I grabbed her arm and tried to tell her this wasn't a normal sick feeling, that my heart was doing something strange and I couldn't catch my breath, but she pulled away and said I was being dramatic, that teenagers always thought minor illnesses were emergencies. Garrett made a comment about how his sister's kids pulled stunts like this whenever they wanted attention, and Mom actually laughed along with him like I wasn't literally gasping for air at her feet. They left me in the hallway and went back to getting ready for their dinner reservation. I could hear them in the master bedroom, Garrett complaining about how this was exactly the kind of behavior he'd warned her about, how teenagers needed firm boundaries and couldn't be coddled every time they had a minor complaint. Mom was agreeing with everything he said, her voice carrying that desperate-to-please tone that made my stomach turn even through the haze of whatever was happening to my body. I managed to crawl into the bathroom, thinking that maybe splashing cold water on my face would help, and that's when my legs gave out completely, and I ended up on that cold tile floor. The pain in my chest had become constant now, a crushing pressure that made every breath feel like my last, and my vision was doing strange things, narrowing and expanding like a camera lens that couldn't focus. I lay there on the bathroom floor, watching my mother check her phone in the doorway, and felt something inside me break that had nothing to do with whatever was physically wrong with my body. She knew I was in trouble. She could see it, and she was choosing her dinner reservation over helping me. Garrett appeared behind her and said they really needed to go or they'd lose their table, and Mom actually stepped back from the bathroom doorway like she was going to leave me there on the floor. I summoned every ounce of strength I had left and called out that I needed to go to the hospital, that this wasn't normal and something was really wrong. Garrett sighed loudly and said this was exactly what his sister had warned him about, that kids my age were manipulative and attention-seeking, and that if Mom gave in to this behavior, I'd be pulling stunts like this every time they had plans. The fact that a man who'd known me for barely a year was advising my mother to ignore my medical crisis made a fury burn through me that temporarily overrode the terror. I told them I wasn't faking, that my chest hurt so badly I thought I was having a heart attack, and Garrett laughed and said 15-year-olds don't have heart attacks. He said I probably ate something that didn't agree with me and should just drink some ginger ale and sleep it off. Mom was nodding along, accepting his medical opinion like he was a doctor instead of an insurance adjuster who thought WebMD made him an expert on everything. I begged my mother to at least call someone, my dad or my grandmother or anyone who could help me, because I genuinely believed I was dying on that bathroom floor. The pressure in my chest was unbearable, and my left arm had started tingling in a way that terrified me because I'd learned in health class that was a symptom of cardiac events. Mom finally came into the bathroom and crouched down next to me, and I thought maybe she was finally going to help, but instead she felt my forehead and announced that I was warm, but not that warm, that I probably just had a fever and was being dramatic about it. She said if I was still feeling bad when they got home from dinner, she'd think about taking me to urgent care in the morning. The morning. Like I could wait until morning when I could barely breathe, and my heart was doing something terrifying in my chest. I started crying, which I hadn't done in front of my mother in years, and she just stood up and told me to take some ibuprofen and try to sleep. Garrett was calling from the living room that their Uber was outside, and she needed to hurry up. She hesitated for 1 second, looking down at me on the floor, and then she walked out of the bathroom without another word. I heard the front door close, and then the apartment was silent, except for the sound of my own labored breathing echoing off the bathroom tiles. I don't know how long I lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness, my body alternating between burning hot and freezing cold, while the pain in my chest continued to worsen. At some point, I managed to get my phone out of my pocket, but my fingers were trembling so badly that I kept hitting the wrong buttons. I tried to call my dad 3 times before I finally connected, and when he answered, I could barely get words out to tell him something was wrong. He said my name over and over, his voice getting more panicked each time, and I managed to croak out that I was sick and Mom had left and I needed help. He told me to hang on, that he was calling 911 and coming to get me, and that I shouldn't try to move. The relief that someone was finally taking this seriously made me start crying again, but this time from gratitude rather than fear. Dad stayed on the phone with me, talking constantly to keep me conscious, asking me questions about what I was feeling and telling me help was on the way. I could hear him in his car, driving faster than I'd ever heard him drive, and the sound of his fear matched my own. The paramedics arrived maybe 12 minutes later, though it felt like hours, and I heard them break down the apartment door when I couldn't get up to let them in. 2 EMTs came rushing into the bathroom, a woman named Lucia and a man named Jerome, and they immediately started assessing me while asking rapid-fire questions about my symptoms. When I described the chest pain and the left arm tingling and the difficulty breathing, their expressions changed in a way that made my stomach drop even further. Lucia attached electrode patches to my chest and connected me to a portable heart monitor, while Jerome started an IV line in my arm. I saw Lucia look at the monitor readings and then exchange a glance with Jerome that clearly communicated something serious, though they kept their voices calm when talking to me. She asked if I had any history of heart problems, and I said no, and then she asked if I'd taken any substances or supplements recently, and I mentioned the protein shake I'd had after practice that came from a new container my mom had bought. Jerome was on his radio calling ahead to the hospital, using medical terminology I didn't fully understand, words like elevated troponin levels and possible myocarditis and pediatric cardiac emergency. They loaded me onto a stretcher and wheeled me out of the apartment, and I remember seeing my neighbors gathered in the hallway with concerned expressions, some of them filming with their phones because that's what people do now when anything dramatic happens. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and jolting movements, and Lucia asking me questions while monitoring my vital signs. My dad met us at the emergency room entrance, his face pale and his hands shaking as he grabbed mine and promised me everything was going to be okay. The ER was controlled chaos, medical professionals moving with urgent efficiency while I was wheeled into a trauma bay and connected to more machines than I could count. A doctor introduced herself as Dr. Amelia Okonkwo, the attending cardiologist, and she explained they were running tests to determine what was causing my cardiac symptoms. She seemed genuinely concerned when she looked at my monitor readings, and she asked the same question about supplements or substances, which made me start to wonder about that protein shake. Dr. Okonkwo ordered blood work and an echocardiogram and a chest x-ray, and while technicians prepped me for these tests, she took my dad aside to speak with him privately. I could see his expression through the glass windows of the trauma bay, watching him go from worried to horrified to something that looked like rage. The test results came back within the hour, and Dr. Okonkwo sat down next to my bed to explain what they'd found. I had acute myocarditis, which she explained was inflammation of the heart muscle, and my blood work showed elevated levels of certain compounds that weren't naturally present in normal protein supplements. She asked again about what I'd consumed that day, and I mentioned the protein shake, describing the new container my mom had recently purchased from a store Garrett had recommended. Dr. Okonkwo's expression remained professionally neutral, but she asked my dad if that container could be brought in for testing, and he said he'd make sure it happened. She explained that my heart had been under severe stress for several hours before I received treatment, and that the delay in getting medical care had likely caused additional damage that might have been prevented with faster intervention. The words hit me like physical blows, each one confirming what I'd already known. My mother's choice to prioritize her dinner date had made my condition worse. Dr. Okonkwo said I'd need to stay in the cardiac ICU for monitoring, and that we'd discuss treatment options once they had a clearer picture of the extent of the damage. My dad stayed with me through the night, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair next to my bed while machines beeped and nurses came in every hour to check my vitals. I drifted in and out of sleep, haunted by fragmented dreams of lying on that bathroom floor while my mother walked away. The next morning, a detective showed up at my hospital room door, a tall man with gray temples who introduced himself as Detective Raymond Cook from the Major Crimes Division. He asked if I felt well enough to answer some questions, and when I nodded, he pulled up a chair and started asking about the events leading up to my hospitalization. I told him everything, from feeling sick after practice to collapsing in the hallway to my mother leaving for her dinner reservation while I lay on the bathroom floor. Detective Cook wrote everything down in a small notebook, occasionally asking clarifying questions, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes sharp with attention. When I mentioned the protein shake and the store Garrett had recommended, he made a note and underlined it twice. He asked if Garrett had ever given me supplements directly, and I remembered that he'd offered me some capsules a few weeks ago that he claimed would enhance my swimming performance, though I'd declined because taking unlabeled pills seemed sketchy. The investigation accelerated rapidly after that conversation. Detective Cook obtained a warrant to search our apartment, and technicians from the crime lab tested the protein powder container I'd been using. The results came back showing that the powder had been contaminated with a substance called isoproterenol, a medication used to treat certain heart conditions that could cause severe cardiac symptoms if taken by someone who didn't need it. The contamination wasn't accidental. Someone had deliberately mixed this substance into my protein powder. The detective told my dad this privately, but I overheard enough to understand that someone had been trying to hurt me, and that the most logical suspects were the two people who had access to my supplements. My dad immediately called a lawyer, a woman named Denise Reeves, who specialized in family law and child abuse cases, and she arrived at the hospital within hours to discuss our options. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and a reputation for aggressive representation, and when she heard the full story, her jaw tightened in a way that suggested she was personally offended by what had happened. My mother showed up at the hospital that afternoon, finally, and she had the audacity to act like she'd been worried sick this whole time. She came into my room with tears in her eyes and tried to hug me, but I turned away and wouldn't let her touch me. Dad was on his feet immediately, placing himself between us, and his voice was colder than I'd ever heard it when he asked where she'd been when I was dying on the bathroom floor. Mom started making excuses, saying she hadn't realized how serious it was, that Garrett had convinced her I was just seeking attention, that she'd wanted to call, but figured I'd be fine until they got home. Every word out of her mouth made things worse, because she wasn't apologizing for leaving me. She was apologizing for getting caught. Detective Cook appeared in the doorway with a uniformed officer and asked if he could speak with my mother, and the look on her face when she realized the police were involved was something I'll never forget. She went from tearful concern to deer-in-headlights panic in a fraction of a second, her eyes darting between the detective and the door like she was calculating escape routes. The detective interviewed my mother in a private room, and I later learned from Denise what was said during that conversation. Mom initially claimed she'd had no idea how sick I was, that I frequently complained about minor ailments for attention, and that leaving for dinner had been a judgment call based on her assessment that I wasn't seriously ill. When Detective Cook asked about the protein powder, Mom said she'd bought it at Garrett's recommendation from a nutrition store he frequented, and that she had no knowledge of any contamination. She deflected every question about Garrett, insisting he was a wonderful partner who'd never do anything to hurt anyone, even as the detective presented evidence that suggested otherwise. The crime lab had found Garrett's fingerprints on the protein powder container in locations inconsistent with casual handling, and when they tested other supplements in the apartment, they found similar contamination in items I hadn't yet opened. Detective Cook told my mother that either she was complicit in poisoning her own child, or she'd been manipulated by someone who was, and either way, her choices that night had nearly killed me. The hospital ran more tests over the next few days, and Dr. Okonkwo explained that the isoproterenol had caused significant stress to my heart muscle, resulting in inflammation that would require months of careful monitoring and potentially lifelong cardiac precautions. She said I was lucky to be alive, that if my dad hadn't called 911 when he did, I might have gone into full cardiac arrest on that bathroom floor while my mother ate steak downtown. The phrase, might have died, echoed in my head for days afterward, bouncing around my skull every time I tried to sleep, reminding me how close I'd come to being another statistic about child neglect. Dr. Okonkwo referred me to a cardiac rehabilitation specialist named Dr. Winston Hale, who would oversee my recovery and help determine whether I'd ever be able to swim competitively again. The thought of losing swimming, the one thing that had always been mine, that had given me purpose and identity and escape, was almost worse than the physical symptoms I was still experiencing. Garrett was arrested 4 days after my hospitalization on charges of assault with intent to cause bodily harm, child endangerment, and administering a poison with intent to injure. Detective Cook called my dad to inform him of the arrest, and I was present when the call came through and watched the complicated mix of emotions cross my father's face. Relief and vindication were there, but also horror at the confirmation that someone had deliberately tried to hurt me, and rage that my mother had either known or should have known what was happening under her roof. The evidence against Garrett was substantial. The crime lab found his internet search history included queries about cardiac symptoms in teenagers and how to mimic heart attacks, along with purchases from chemical supply websites that matched the compounds found in my supplements. His motive, the detective explained, appeared to be wanting me out of the picture. He'd been pressuring my mother to send me to live with my dad full-time, and when she'd resisted, he'd apparently decided to create a situation where she'd have no choice. My mother wasn't arrested initially, though she was named as a person of interest in the ongoing investigation. The question of whether she knew about Garrett's plans remained unresolved, with evidence pointing in both directions. She'd bought the contaminated protein powder, but at his recommendation. She'd ignored obvious signs of medical distress, but at his insistence. She'd left me on that bathroom floor, but he'd been the one pressuring her to go. Denise Reeves explained that prosecutors were still building their case, and that my mother might face charges ranging from criminal negligence to conspiracy, depending on what additional evidence emerged. In the meantime, my dad filed emergency custody motions, and a family court judge granted him temporary full custody based on the circumstances. I was discharged from the hospital after 8 days with a strict medication regimen, activity restrictions, and appointments scheduled with both Dr. Okonkwo and Dr. Hale for ongoing monitoring. Moving my belongings out of my mother's apartment while she stood there crying and trying to apologize was one of the hardest things I've ever done. The next few months were a blur of medical appointments, legal proceedings, and therapy sessions as I tried to process what had happened. I started seeing a psychologist named Dr. Patricia Navarro, who specialized in trauma related to family betrayal, and she helped me understand that my feelings of anger and grief and confusion were all valid responses to an objectively traumatic experience. She also helped me work through the complicated emotions I had about my mother, because despite everything, part of me still loved her and still remembered the mom she'd been before Garrett, before the divorce, before whatever broke inside her that made her capable of leaving her sick child on a bathroom floor. Dr. Navarro said this kind of ambivalence was common in abuse survivors, and that I didn't have to choose between hating my mother and forgiving her. I could hold both truths simultaneously, acknowledging that she'd failed me catastrophically while also grieving the loss of the relationship we'd once had. My cardiac rehabilitation progressed slowly but steadily under Dr. Hale's supervision. The inflammation in my heart muscle gradually decreased, and my strength improved with careful, monitored exercise programs designed specifically for my condition. Dr. Hale was cautiously optimistic that I'd eventually be able to return to some form of competitive swimming, though he warned that I'd need to be careful about overexertion and would require cardiac monitoring for years to come. The thought of getting back in the pool kept me motivated through the difficult days when my chest ached and my energy was non-existent, and I wondered if I'd ever feel normal again. My swim team coach, Coach Reyes, came to visit me at my dad's house and told me that my spot on the team would be waiting whenever I was ready, and that the whole team was rooting for my recovery. The support from my teammates and coaches helped counterbalance the devastation of what had happened at home. Garrett's trial began 6 months after my hospitalization, and I had to testify about the events of that night and the months leading up to it. The prosecutor, an intense woman named Angela Foster, prepared me extensively for what to expect on the stand, explaining that Garrett's defense attorney would try to make me look unreliable or attention-seeking. She warned me that they might bring up the fact that I'd had conflicts with Garrett before, trying to paint my testimony as biased or revenge-motivated. When the day came, I sat in that witness chair and answered every question as clearly and calmly as I could, describing the night of my collapse in detail, while Garrett sat at the defense table staring at me with undisguised hatred. His lawyer tried to suggest that the contamination might have occurred at the manufacturing facility, that Garrett's internet searches were innocent curiosity, and that my mother's decision to leave that night was reasonable parenting rather than neglect. But the evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern too clear, and the jury didn't buy the alternative explanations. Garrett was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 12 years in state prison, with the judge explicitly citing the premeditated nature of the poisoning and the fact that his victim was a minor entrusted to his care. The prosecutor read a victim impact statement I'd written about how this experience had affected my life, my health, my trust in the people who were supposed to protect me. Garrett's expression remained blank throughout the reading, like he felt no remorse for what he'd done, and when he was led away in handcuffs, he didn't even glance in my direction. My mother was in the courtroom that day, sitting in the back row with her own lawyer, and I saw tears streaming down her face as the verdict was read. I didn't know if she was crying for Garrett, for herself, or for me, and I found that I didn't particularly care anymore. The woman who'd been my mother had stopped existing for me on the night she walked out of that bathroom and left me to potentially die. The charges against my mother were resolved separately, through a plea agreement that Denise Reeves negotiated on my family's behalf as part of the civil case we'd filed. Mom pleaded guilty to criminal negligence resulting in bodily harm and received 2 years of probation, mandatory counseling, and a permanent protective order prohibiting contact with me until I turned 18. She also agreed to pay restitution for my medical expenses and to surrender all custody rights, making my father's full custody permanent. The day those documents were finalized, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness, like I was finally safe but also officially motherless in a way that couldn't be undone. Denise told me that the outcome was actually quite favorable given the circumstances, that prosecutors had initially considered more serious charges, but ultimately decided that the evidence of her direct knowledge was insufficient. Whether she truly hadn't known what Garrett was doing or had willfully blinded herself to the signs, only she knew for certain. 1 year after my hospitalization, I was finally cleared for competitive swimming by Dr. Hale, with restrictions and monitoring requirements but genuine medical approval to return to the sport I loved. The first time I dove into the pool at official practice, Coach Reyes leading warm-ups and my teammates cheering me on, I felt something unlock inside my chest that had nothing to do with cardiac inflammation. The water embraced me like an old friend, and my body remembered movements it had been practicing since childhood. And for those moments in the pool, I wasn't a victim or a survivor or a cautionary tale. I was just a swimmer, doing what I was born to do. My times were slower than before, and I tired more quickly, and I had to wear a heart monitor during intense training, but I was back. I'd survived something that was supposed to destroy me, and I'd reclaimed this piece of my identity that no one could take away. My relationship with my dad deepened significantly in the aftermath of everything, partly from gratitude that he'd saved my life, and partly from the simple fact of spending more time together. He'd restructured his work schedule to be more present, hiring an additional project manager at his construction company so he could be home for dinners and weekends. We talked about things we'd never discussed before, serious conversations about my future and my feelings and my slowly healing heart, both the physical one and the metaphorical one. He told me he blamed himself sometimes for not seeing the warning signs earlier, for not fighting harder for full custody when Mom first started dating Garrett. I told him that none of this was his fault, that he couldn't have predicted someone would try to poison his son, and that what mattered was that he'd answered the phone that night when I needed him most. We'd always had a good relationship, but it evolved into something deeper and more honest, a partnership rather than just a parent-child dynamic. I heard through relatives that my mother moved away after the trial, relocating to another state where no one knew her history. She'd apparently gotten a new job, new friends, a new life built on the ruins of the one she'd destroyed. Sometimes I wondered if she thought about me, if she regretted her choices, if she understood the magnitude of what she'd thrown away for a man who'd been trying to kill her son. Doctor Navarro said these kinds of thoughts were normal and that I shouldn't feel guilty for still caring about my mother's well-being, even after everything she'd done. She also said I shouldn't feel obligated to ever speak to her again, that forgiveness was my choice to make and no one else's timeline to dictate. I hadn't decided yet what I wanted our future relationship to look like, if any, and Dr. Navarro said that was okay too. Some decisions don't have to be made immediately. They can wait until you're ready. My senior year of high school, I broke my personal record in the 200-meter freestyle at the regional championships, finishing 3rd overall and earning a recruitment look from several college programs. When I stood on that podium, bronze medal around my neck and my dad cheering from the stands, I thought about everything I'd survived to get to that moment. The bathroom floor, the ambulance ride, the cardiac ICU, the months of rehabilitation, the trial, the testimony, the slow, painful work of rebuilding myself from the wreckage of my mother's betrayal. None of it had been easy, and scars remained, both visible and invisible. But I was still here, still swimming, still fighting, still alive despite someone's best efforts to make me otherwise. I'm in college now, studying pre-medicine because surviving my own cardiac emergency made me want to help others survive theirs. My heart condition is stable and well managed, requiring only annual checkups and daily medication that's become as routine as brushing my teeth. I still swim, though recreationally rather than competitively, and the water still feels like the one place where everything makes sense. Dad came to my college graduation last month, and he was crying so hard he could barely clap when they called my name. In his speech at the dinner afterward, he said he'd never been prouder of who I'd become, and that watching me overcome everything I'd been through was the greatest honor of his life. My mother sent a card, somehow finding my address despite the protective order having expired, and I threw it away without opening it. Maybe someday I'll be ready for that conversation, but not yet. Some distances need to remain until you're strong enough to close them safely. The night that changed everything, when I lay dying on a bathroom floor while my mother chose dinner over my life, could have ended me in multiple ways. I could have died from the poisoning. I could have let the trauma destroy my trust, my ambition, my ability to love and be loved, I could have become bitter, angry, closed off from the world that had hurt me so badly. Instead, I chose to survive, not just physically, but emotionally, reconstructing myself into someone stronger and more resilient than the scared kid who'd collapsed in that hallway. The scar tissue on my heart, literal and metaphorical, is just another part of my story now. A reminder of what I overcame, rather than what broke me. I don't know if my mother will ever truly understand what she threw away that night, what her choice cost both of us. But I've stopped needing her to understand. My healing doesn't depend on her remorse. My future doesn't require her approval. I learned the hardest way possible that the people who are supposed to protect you can become the people you need protection from, and that sometimes the family you build is stronger than the family you were born into. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.